Colleagues, welcome. Welcome. My name is Colin Lindsay, and I'm a professor and researcher here at Strathclyde Business School, or rather here in my kitchen while I'm currently excluded along with many of my colleagues from Strathclyde Business School. Welcome to today's webinar from Strathclyde Business School called Rethinking Welfare and Employability Services for People with Health and Disability-Related Barriers, Challenges for Policy Post-COVID. I'm going to do a very small amount of housekeeping, and then I'm going to hand over to our three expert speakers and to your discussion and question and answers. So some housekeeping is that this webinar is being recorded. That means on the upside that you can direct your friends and colleagues to a link that will be made available after this webinar if you want to catch up on the webinar again or share the lessons from the webinar more widely. Only the presenters and myself will be on screen, but if anyone who is an attendee has any problem with being part of a webinar that is being recorded, I would suggest leaving now. So that's the housekeeping on recording. We've got three fantastic speakers who are going to provide the framing for our discussion today. The way that we thought we would do this discussion is that our three keynotes will speak for perhaps maybe 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open out for discussion, for your questions, and for debate within the group. Our intention is that most of the discussion will take place at the end of those three presentations. If there is any particular point of clarification, any very specific question that you wish to ask any one presenter, please do that through the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to that immediately after each speaker. Other than that, we'll bundle together your questions and issues, and we'll deal with those at the end. The chat function is disabled. Please use the question and answer function to provide comments, raise issues, and ask questions that you want to be addressed in our discussion. So I think that's the housekeeping done. The context for our discussion today is a problem prior to COVID and a challenge after COVID. Before COVID, the employment rate for people with disabilities was 53% in the UK. For people without disabilities was over 80%. And solving that disability employment gap has been a priority for policymakers here in Scotland, where we're speaking to you from, in the rest of the UK and beyond. And more broadly, supporting people with health and disability-related barriers to progress towards work has been a long-standing and complex challenge faced by policymakers. That was before COVID, and now COVID has arrived, and the Scottish and UK and many other labour markets are set to experience a significant rise in unemployment as a result of the COVID crisis. And while policymakers are understandably prioritising measures to combat long-term unemployment and youth unemployment, there's a real need that we make sure that people with health and disability-related barriers are not left behind. On the other hand, we might argue that the labour market and the type of jobs that sometimes exclude people with health problems and disabilities have been radically restructured, may no longer exist. We're moving to a world with different jobs, different ways of working, different office spaces, different workplaces. Does that create opportunities to engage people with health and disability-related barriers more effectively? That's the focus for our discussion today. How can welfare and social security policies support people with health and disability-related barriers while supporting them to progress towards work? What kind of employability policies might work? What role can be played by employers in the new workplace? And what kind of innovative workplace strategies, for instance, individual placement and support, might be effective in this context? That's what we're going to be discussing over the next hour. We have three fantastic keynote speakers to help us through that discussion before we open it out to your views and your questions. I'm going to very briefly introduce those three keynotes in reverse order before we move to our first discussion and presentation. So our last presenter today will be Dr. Elke Loeffler from the University of Strathclyde, my colleague here at the University of Strathclyde. Ilka's a senior lecturer here at Strathclyde Business School, and she's conducted extensive research, particularly focusing on innovation and co-production in public services, and she's going to share some insights around co-production labs in employment services in Germany based on research that she has very recently completed. Sharon Wright is Professor of Social Policy at the University of Glasgow. Sharon is an expert in universal credit and welfare conditionality, welcome Sharon, and sanctions, and investigates lived experience of people through the employment and social security system. Sharon's current research looks at work welfare transitions amongst people with mental health problems. And our first speaker is Dr. Adam Whitworth from the University of Sheffield. Adam is a senior lecturer at Sheffield. His research focuses on the effective development and delivery of employment support policies. He is currently chair of the Department of Work and Pensions Contract Management and Partner Delivery Engagement Forum, quite a mouthful, but a very important piece of work. He's also chair of the National Network of Mayoral Combined Authority Employment Leads. And across a career that has spanned lots of areas of research on health and employability, Adam is particularly expert in individual placement and support and its effectiveness. And I think Adam also wants to talk today about both individual placement and support as an employability policy and perhaps modified individual placement and support as a new and innovative way of thinking about supporting people with health problems in the labour market. And with that, I'll stop talking and hand over to our first keynotes. Please use the Q&A function if you want to raise issues or discuss. And with that, the floor is yours, Adam.
Fabulous, Colin. Thank you so much. And welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. And great to have so many people sharing my passion and Sharon's passion and Elka's passion, Colin's for all things H&D and employment. As Colin said, I'm an academic at the University of Sheffield, focusing on basically the design of effective employment support programs. I'm going to give I want to focus on, if you like, implications of COVID on current business as usual, mainstream employment support, and I think an opportunity / need to think more about individual placement support, IPS, but really in particular, what I'll describe as modified IPS, how that can help mainstream business as usual, if you like, employment support. So if you like, it's about learnings from an IPS debate that's been focused on this health and disability cohort, how we can pull some of those learnings more broadly into mainstream employment support through modifications. That has implications, of course, for individuals who are unemployed with health conditions, but also more broadly. I think there's real things that we can learn. So that's broadly what I'm going to do. A bit of a whistle-stop tour, as Colin said, about 10 minutes or so I'm going to talk for. So I'm just not going to attempt to get into loads of detail. But I'm really, really happy to have follow-on conversations if people want to pursue any of this. I should say that what I'll be pulling on is, of course, academic research, various publications of mine in this sort of area, but also, as Colin sort of hinted at some of it, quite extensive policy work. So some of that pulls through. So particularly in recent years, kind of significantly seconded to DWP, supporting them with work and health program design. And then Sheffield City Region Combined Authority, where really the major focus was around leading co-design and then mobilization of a big flagship joint work and health unit modified IPS program. So a lot of learnings and interactions between what I'll say here and that work as well. And also with colleagues from the health system locally, the integrated care system here, around, if you like, what I'll describe as traditional IPS inside secondary mental health teams. So I've got a bit of kind of policy experience, I suppose, that is really helpful for thinking through the ideas. Okay, so COVID and employment support, you know, it's in a way been radical and in a way not, I suppose. So the radical stuff is this kind of deluge of redundancies, both already occurred and many more expected, unfortunately. Furlough has delayed and kind of propped up some of that, but that will gradually unwind. Massive changes in terms of volumes and universal credit and the types of people newly brought into universal credit, and also impacts for the types of support that can be offered in this kind of new COVID reality. But really what I want to start with is that what that really for me shines a light on are some of the long-standing problems and limitations really of UK business as usual employment support that COVID really in a way just enormously kind of escalates the clarity and the obviousness of some of those problems. And I've written previously, I think there's three main major problems in business as usual, by which I mean both JCP, Job Centre Plus, but also some of the contracted offer as well. I'm talking about both. I think this has relevance for. The three main issues, I think, are capacity. We simply don't have enough of it. We can't support enough people. Some are largely excluded from the system and caseloads are far too high to offer really significant, meaningful support substantively. The second one is connectivity, issues around integration, partnership working. How do we better connect employment workers with the range of support services that wrap around people, housing, health, debt, and so on. And the third is about the character of the programs that we build, their values, their principles, the model design itself, some of the nitty gritty around the design, and things like conditionality. And I and many others, of course, think that there's major problems in some of those areas, and central gov are well aware of many of them, I know. So that's the starting point, I suppose, trying to respond to some of those long-standing challenges. And I think there's ways that we can do that by thinking around IPS and modified IPS. So IPS, many people may be aware, is individual placement and support. It's a model of employment support targeted around individuals with severe mental health issues inside secondary mental health teams. That's its origins. In the UK, there's lots of activity around it at the moment. NHS England rolling out a doubling of IPS in secondary mental health teams, and IPS Grow is the kind of entity wrapped around that, supporting that. Why the interest in IPS, and for me, also focusing more today on modified IPS. IPS sits inside those secondary mental health teams. Modified IPS speaks more broadly, which I'll come to. But why the interest in IPS? If you were interested in effective employment support for people with health conditions, the evidence base would lead you towards IPS. So we see lots of international randomized control trials, effectiveness, like way beyond anything that DWP would ordinarily expect for this cohort, way beyond. So sort of effect sizes between treatment and control of in excess of 30, 35 percentage points. So massive effects. So understandably, central gov are interested in terms of effectiveness, but also in terms of savings and cost benefit analyses, which stack up pretty well. Its principles, IPS is important to understand in terms of its principles, and then more formally, if you like, in terms of its fidelity model that it rests on. And they're key to what IPS is, if you like. It's a much more prescriptive program than a standard kind of DWP contracted black box offer. So the principles are really important to get an understanding of the ethos. Things like place then train, universality, co-location, it's voluntary, it's substantively personalized. So things like job matching are taken seriously. Really proactive employer engagement. So it's not just a supply side model, really active employer engagement. Things like job carving as well. And negotiations with employers about what they need and what can work. Low caseloads are key. So the ambition is below 20 compared to something like 100 or so in a standard contractual JCP model. And in-work sustainment. So they're the kind of the ethos and the principles. And then fidelity is, if you like, the formal model of what good IPS looks like. So there's 25 characteristics, essentially services design and then deliver and then self-measure how they stack up against those 25 fidelity criteria, a score going up to 125. So you can self-rate your fidelity to IPS as a model, if you like. So it's quite formal. So it significantly fills in the black box, if you like. That can be very helpful, in my view, in many ways, also potentially a bit risky in terms of prescription. So it needs to be handled carefully, but potentially very helpful. So that's IPS. And then what's modified IPS, if you like? So modified IPS is a central gov interest in basically taking the kernel of that effectiveness and that model and saying, well, okay, hang on, can we stretch this to mainstream cohorts inside primary care settings or community settings, and learn from it and gain some of those benefits. There's been a variety, I won't go through them all, but in a way, a kind of almost too many, a slightly fragmented offer from central government around multiple large scale. So the one that I was involved in Sheffield City region was from the Joint Work and Health Unit. That was one of the larger ones, but there's a variety of them with basically different kinds of low to moderate health cohorts in primary care or community settings. Some around mental health, some musculoskeletal issues, some around substances, some around autism and learning disabilities and so on. So there's lots of activity and lots of interest, understandably, and lots of evaluations running about their effectiveness. By modified IPS, I should say what I mean is not IPS light. Sometimes people talk about IPS light, which really what they mean is just a quantitative dilution of caseloads to make it cheaper. That's the big driver of cost, is caseloads and staffing. So you can make it a lot cheaper. That's quite attractive to central gov in many ways for mainstream cohorts just by diluting. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking by modified IPS about qualitatively different types of IPS model. And some of my academic work sets this out for people who are super keen. Basically a continuum from very discrete models to much more integrated models. And those integrated models are really interesting. That's what we developed when we did it with the Work and Health Unit. In an integrated model, you essentially pull on existing local infrastructure and local services like employee engagement teams, mental health teams, and so on, rather than trying to get your IPS service to do everything, which is what a traditional IPS model does. By doing that, you can, if you do it well, you can do it better by integrating existing services, working with different stakeholders, and you can also do it a lot cheaper. So that's modified IPS. Why do I think this is all relevant, interesting, a kind of opportunity need in the era of COVID? There's 5 or 6 main reasons. I'll just quickly move through. The first is that business as usual isn't working, hasn't been for a long time for many cohorts. For this kind of cohort, people with moderate to high needs, including health needs, but a range of other needs, I would like to see stronger outcomes and stronger savings. And the evidence and the logic takes us towards thinking about these kind of things, in my view. The second is that there's a really strong and consistent attention to values, to principles, and to the quality of delivery, both in its design and its ongoing implementation. The third is to kind of move away from this. We've seen, particularly through things like work program, this slight panacea that aggressive payment by results can fix everything, that black box is always the way to go. And IPS and modified IPS respond to some of that, and they tackle and make explicit attention to things like parking and poor delivery. The fourth is about reconnecting with experiences. So we, unfortunately, I think we'll be seeing more extended periods of unemployment for many people. IPS and modified IPS do a much better job about giving attention to the well-being, the engagement, the motivation, the co-design of service users through programs. And so the experience of unemployment and activation is from a mental health well-being, but also engagement perspective, much stronger. And that becomes more important as those durations of unemployment go up, I think. The fifth is about helping employers. Fragile employers, particularly SMEs who might be struggling to just get going again as we gradually ease and try and rehire, but also deluged employers who are now being increasingly bombarded with applications. This kind of model can help those employers to match, to carve, but also those jobs to stick. And the last one is about integration. So if we think about the system more broadly, this way of thinking, I think, around modified IPS and integrated versions of it can help us to think about better integrated delivery across stakeholders, across tiers of government and locally, and more ambitiously, it can help us think about what I describe as developing a kind of integration infrastructure that's more sustainable beyond just the rotation of providers. So I'll leave it there. That's plenty. Thank you.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks, Adam. As I was saying, we'll perhaps draw questions together at the end. One very practical question that's been asked is, where can we read this stuff? This video, and we'll perhaps put up some links to relevant material, will be available online. So I'll make sure I communicate that out to people. I should say that if you're not an academic, you might find that some of our research is behind a paywall in academic journals, but academics do like their research being read by policy stakeholders. So if you contact anyone on this Zoom webinar, I'm sure all of us will be delighted to share any research that you are interested in. There are a couple of questions around values and conditionality, Adam, that you raised, but I think actually they segue very nicely and connect very nicely with what Sharon's going to talk about. So I think maybe we will pick those up in the more general discussion later on. And if that's okay with you, Sharon, I'll now invite you to speak to us about conditionality, social security, and people with health and disability related challenges. Sharon, over to you.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks, Adam, as well. I think these two elements fit really well together. Oh, I've not put this up. Here we go. And hi, everybody. It's really strange to not be able to see people's faces, but I can see from the participant list that there's a lot of familiar people here on the call, colleagues, academics, but also in the third sector and NHS, Scottish Government and further afield. So thank you for joining the call. It's a really important discussion. I wanted to talk about conditionality and the punitive dimensions of conditionality that actually don't necessarily help when it comes to employability. So when I'm talking here, I'm drawing on a range of research studies and those have all been collaborative. So I just want to have a shout out here to my colleagues. Currently, I'm working with Anna Gavlovich on a Health Foundation project, which is also in partnership with the Poverty Alliance and Laura Robertson. And Alistair Stewart has been working on these projects and others before them as well at the University of Glasgow. So thank you very much to all those people who have made that research possible. So what I've been looking at is the system more broadly in the UK, and then how that interrelates with the Scottish system as it's developing on a whole new set of values, human rights, and new values of dignity, fairness, and respect. So as we all probably know, benefit conditionality is very harsh in the UK, the second harshest in the world, and it's far too harsh in my view, and actually quite cruel. What it does to people is very damaging in terms of mental health and can actually worsen physical and mental health. So the system, the broader system, is not just a sort of passive system that's out there, it's something that's actively a force in our society, and it is actively shaping people's experiences and in many cases worsening already very difficult physical and mental health conditions. Sanctions are still really harsh, easily triggered and disproportionate to the infringements that they exist for. We've had more than a decade now of counterproductive conditionality, and what's interesting here, I think, is for the broader concern that we all have with, okay, well, how can we help people get back into work now, especially during the pandemic, and if there ever is an after, if there's ever a post-COVID world, how are we going to help support people in that world and for looking for work? And one of the really bad things that conditionality has done is to make looking for work a really risky activity. So many people with mental health problems, disabled people, physical health conditions in the long term can't really afford to risk putting their head above the parapet to look for a job, because the consequences are potentially life-altering. And in my research on the Welfare Conditionality Project, we spoke to people who considered suicide very seriously, and also people who had various very, very serious consequences because of sanctions, such as losing their home, or just it all got too much for them. It's so stressful that they gave up a tenancy. One man, for example, went and lived by the river in a tent rather than have to go to the job centre. So for more than a decade, that relationship between government via Job Centre Plus and DWP and citizens has been eroded. That trust has been really undermined, and there's a huge job to be done by people in all sorts of services to rebuild trust to an extent that disabled people can trust those people that they're working with to actually help them, and not push them into destitution or cause them to use a food bank, or risk losing their home. So we can't underestimate the challenge that's ahead in that respect. And also it's been the punishing part of the system is still there. So when COVID was hopefully at its worst under lockdown, the sanctions regime was eased, and so it was put on hold for a while, but it wasn't long until that came back again. And I was hoping maybe that the government would decide to hold back on conditionality, especially currently whilst people are still affected by the pandemic. But that also shows the wider reasons that people are often affected for health reasons, can't go to the job centre or shouldn't go to the job centre to meet their conditionality. So the rewards are diminishing, employment opportunities are going to be harder. And it's interesting when Adam was talking there about business as usual, we've maybe got lulled into a false sense of security of thinking that the way the labour market was recently is somehow typical. So we had a 46-year low in unemployment and record-breaking levels of employment, even though of course we know there was underemployment and issues to do with precarious forms of work. But it's not like we're moving from a situation where things were usual in a sense. We're moving from a situation where it was highly unusual in unemployment being very, very low, and there being actually quite a lot of jobs available, to a situation that where we can see that the economy has caused unemployment. The pandemic has directly resulted in people losing their jobs, and many people having to rely on services and systems that were designed in a time of plenty that are not really capable of coping with the numbers, and the values that are underlying it are not doing us any favours. So I just wanted to note also, it's not just about people actually receiving sanctions, it's also the threat of sanctions that's problematic. And in multiple studies that I've done, people have talked about, claimants have talked about how they felt really nervous and under pressure and really worried, even if they had never been sanctioned. Just the prospect of it shaped their whole interaction with services, not just directly with the job centre, but people are scared to share information that might lead to anything being interpreted as missing or not quite meeting the rules. And it's difficult to know what the expectations are when they can change because of discretion. So I want to share my screen with you for a second. I followed advice from colleagues not to have a whole load of PowerPoint slides, but I want to share this one with you, if I can. It's a test. Will it work? Oh, I need to maximize it. Hold on. Here we go. I can do this. I can do technology, everyone. Look at this. So this is the system, right? This is the UK system. An enormous stick, and then down here, like a tiny little carrot. And the change in labour market means that this carrot is getting gnawed away smaller and smaller. There are diminishing job prospects here, and the financial rewards are very limited. Right, I'm going to stop sharing. What's happening now? I've lost myself. Okay. As well as that, so as well as the conditionality side of it, which shapes a great deal of the interaction between claimants and many different benefits, there are also a range of issues related to work capability assessments. And in my current project, we're looking at mental health, and we're finding that mental health is not adequately recognised by work capability assessments. So on the one hand, the system is having an adverse mental health impact, and then at the same time, it fails to recognise the mental ill health that it's contributing to. So in particular, we found a lot of people affected by depression and anxiety. And I know that there are other studies, for example, Evan Williams' work that shows the adverse mental health impacts of sanctions amongst JSA claimants. So in terms of disability and ill health, has been a really long-term strategy to get people off benefits. And it's hard to come on the back of that with some ideas about, hey, let's find you a job, when people know very well that there's a whole huge raft of measures that are designed to just get them off benefits. Also worth mentioning that in a recent study funded by Joseph Rowntree Foundation, myself and Laura Robertson found that we spoke to work coaches, and they said they weren't always sure how to deal with people with very complex or serious health conditions, including mental health problems. And they felt in some cases that the people they were talking to felt they shouldn't be there, that they shouldn't be in front of a work coach, they shouldn't be subject to job search expectations. Universal credit, of course, hasn't necessarily helped the situation. There's still a major issue with the 5-week wait, and this is part of the counterproductive design of the system, because most people feel like that wait is a disincentive to claiming, so they don't want to start looking for work if it doesn't work out, and then end up on universal credit with nothing for 5 weeks, or this impossible choice: do you take an advance payment and then have a long-term struggle to repay it, or do you do without and maybe have a very difficult time? Ongoing issues with housing payments, rent arrears. And also I was just reading on Twitter, that's how I'm mainly informed about the world these days, that the benefit cap has affected, there's been a 97% increase in people affected by the benefit cap because of COVID, because so many more people have come on to benefits. So it's a positive that universal credit was increased by £20 during COVID, and that stays in place, I think, until March 21, but slightly undone with the benefit cap. So there are a lot of issues, and the existing system demands a huge amount of people. So the default for job search is 35 hours of job search a week. For people with health conditions, that should be reduced, but in our research we found a lot of people who still had to do a lot of job search considering how serious their health conditions were. For example, one man in Glasgow who had a brain injury, who was still expected to look for work 16 hours a week. It was just unfathomable, really, what sorts of jobs he would actually manage to do. And what that also does is it generates, this is a point Adam made as well, it generates copious unsuitable job applications. And Joe Ingold's research at the University of Leeds has also picked up on that from the employer's perspective, that employers have been inundated with applications that are not necessarily from people who could do the job or would even want the job, but they have to because of the job search expectations. So there's certainly something that could be done in lowering those expectations for the sake of claimants, but also for the sake of employers. So that's a bit of dysfunctional job match practice that's going on. Okay, I've got 2 more slides and then I'm going to finish up. I'm trying to judge by Colin's face, like how badly over time I've gone. I don't know. Oh dear, he's giving me the thumbs down sign. Right, I'll be quick, right. So I just wanted to reinforce this point about different choices about service design. And Giuliano Bonoli identified these 4 different types of activation in Europe. So in the UK, all we really do is this top one, incentive reinforcement, by threatening people: if you don't find yourself a job, you'll lose all your money, maybe your house. These other 3 options are available. So we could help people more through employment, and this is where we get into the sorts of placement services or support. Occupation, we could actually create jobs, and that's maybe something that the Scottish Government or local authorities could look into. Human capital investment also could focus more on vocational training. So that's something that could be done locally, is to have more of an engagement with what is it that employers need and what sort of training would somebody require in order to do that in a much more developed way than currently happens in the UK. And then my final point, which is actually quite a big point, comes from an article that I did a few years ago, where I was looking at how the system deals with people. And the UK system, universal credit, employment support allowance, job seekers, treats people as if they only really matter if something else happens. So if they get a job, then everything's fine. So it treats them as how they're going to become rather than how they are. And that's based on a sort of top-down understanding of how society works. And it emphasises individual failure, or kind of sets people up as if being out of work is their own fault, which we can see in the current circumstances mainly is not. The focus is on the individual as being either somehow immoral or incompetent, and the focus is on the future. It's about changing people to become something different, and it's about changing behaviour, so they should look for more jobs for some other outcome. So the force is to become active, and the interaction is all about really telling people what to do, or pushing people to get a job. But the other side of that, which does go on in some services but could certainly be developed more, the alternative could be to treat people more as beings as they are now. So coming from a more bottom-up approach to understanding lived experience. So that would be to treat people not as failures, but as people who are competent but disempowered or discriminated against, people who are capable, creative, reflexive and resourceful. So you could ask people more about what their situation really is rather than what it should change to. So it's more focused on the present, it's more about getting alongside people than just telling them some predefined solution. And the focus would be more on recognition and empowerment, to recognise what people are already doing rather than what somebody else thinks they should do. And so the bottom line on all of that is, rather than telling people to find a job, I think a lot can be done in employability by listening to people themselves. You're going to stop talking now.
Thanks so much, Sharon. Only a little over time, and perfect in every other way, as usual. Thanks so much for that. I want to move on to Elka, but I'm going to try and, there's a lot of questions and a lot of discussion. So I'm going to try and tick off a couple of questions to Adam, which came in kind of late, but I'd like to pose to Adam, and then maybe ask a question that's a much broader question that connects the talks of both Adam and Sharon. So I hope that's okay if Adam and Sharon can punch through those questions, and then we'll move on to Elka's contribution. Adam, a couple of very specific challenges to you, or questions around you. Colleague asks, is there much of an evidence base in terms of, for instance, RCTs on the outcomes delivered by IPS as opposed to modified IPS? Or are there RCTs or other research ongoing that might help us get a handle on that? So that's question one. And then I'll ask you this other one, which again is maybe even too challenging even for you. What role might there be for AI going forward in terms of IPS? Could that be could we use those kind of technologies in future early intervention? And then I'll move on to a broader question that connects your two talks. Do you want to try have a quick go at those two, Adam?
Quick go at those two. Good luck. I've actually, I should say, Colin, I think I've answered them.
Oh, have you?
in type in the Q&A box. So, but I'll speak to them. So the second one, machine learning and AI. Yeah, I think potentially. I think the starting point for me would have to be a bit cautious. You know, there's lots of activity around DWP and AI and so on, algorithmic decision making. I think I prefer to talk more about data assisted decision making, where we can use data analytics to help guide frontline staff to make decisions, but the decisions ultimately rest with frontline staff. I think there's quite significant risks, as kind of reports are beginning to show, around kind of blind data driven decision making. So I wouldn't be terribly supportive, but absolutely I think we can do a lot with data analytics and potentially AI around data assistance for frontline staff. And the first one, sorry, was evidence around RCTs for modified IPS. No, there's not really. So there's a variety of modified IPS programs going at the moment, and they will report based on RCT sometime next year. Part of the challenge is, honestly, because IPS is very formal and very well badged, and therefore the evaluations know what it is and what to look for and what to call it. Modified IPS is not that. It's people like me talking around this, and some of my work has begun to formalize it. But in reality, in a way, a bit like IPS, but a more extreme version, there's lots of programs that look a bit like modified IPS and have elements of it, but they're not formalized in any way. And so even if they're evaluated, the evaluations don't capture that, and they wouldn't be badged as that. So I would say it's sort of needs, partly it's about formalization of that as a model, and partly around the kind of formal evaluation of those programs.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And I think if I can summarize a point that's been made in various places in the discussion, I think what a number of questioners are asking is it possible to run programs on these kind of principles, for instance, IPS, within the current conditionality system? Third sector colleagues saying we'd really like to contribute expertise to assisting people with health and disability challenges to move towards work. But not only do we not like sanctions, our organisation, in terms of our values and our mission, simply cannot engage when there's that kind of punitive element of services. And I think another questioner asked, how does this kind of approach around IPS fit with what happens in job centres every day? Sharon, do you want to maybe come in first, and then I'll come back to you, Adam?
Yeah, I think that is a really valid concern. And one of my other colleagues, Jim Kaufman, is a participant in the audience today. And his work shows that what work coaches even, or advisors in employability services sometimes do, is shield their clients from conditionality, because they know the potential consequences can be very serious. So it's not necessarily about what happens within the service itself. I also saw a question on the chat there, which was about Fair Start Scotland, and do people think they can be sanctioned on that because they can't? And yeah, they can, but they could still be sanctioned on their main benefit for something else. So it's very difficult, like when the overarching system is so punitive, it's very difficult for people to really relax and be like, okay, so this is separate, and this, I'm okay here, and it's hard for people to know. And when the stakes are so high, it's very difficult to convince people, I think, that it really is safe, when even if it is even if it is. And then also I saw another comment there which was about easing up on sanctions. Yes, there has been an internal change in DWP, and we did find in our most recent study that there has been an easing up on sanctions. For example, I spoke to one work coach who said, I've worked here for a year, I've never sanctioned anyone. I was like, excellent, good news. And so, but I think what's interesting there is that that has happened internally. And we also think that the initial great sanctions drive, as David Webster calls it, was about an internal change. So it's not evident in policy or law, it's about practice. So it's about the guidance given and the targets that are given internally to work coaches. So we believe that those have been taken away, and they've been replaced by expectations. It sounds a bit sinister to me. I don't know if those work better or worse, but there's definitely claimants do feel like there's less emphasis on sanctions, but there is still a lot of fear. And there's a lot of fear even just about going on to universal credit because of the 5-week wait, as well as because of the opening it up to sanctions. Yeah, I thought I might just come back to that issue about AI as well, because any system, any sort of machine system is only as good as its programming. And I was in Australia a couple of years ago where they're much more into this kind of thing. And there were some quite alarming ways in which that was working because of the way it was programming. So for example, they were developing, I spoke to the actual person who was developing this system. It's like an app that people would use on their phone when they were going to claim for benefit. And it was like 10 questions about your mental health. And I was just like, oh, you can't just like ask people that on an app when the consequence is either you're going to get some money or you're not going to get some money, and potentially open up all sorts of, like, you could open somebody up to crisis point. So I think you need to be very careful. And mainly what people were saying to us in these series of related research projects is that they wanted human interaction, and they wanted long interviews, and they wanted things that were focused on their experience, their sort of whole range of experience, not to be like sort of treated in one way because they're categorized as something or another. And they also in Australia had this thing for disability benefits where when you start the claims process, it's done via computer, but it's like a computer generated person that says, hello, would you like to start your claim? And that's also, I think, a little bit unsatisfactory.
Okay, great, thanks. I do want to move on to Elka, but do you want to very quickly come in, Adam, and you're at the heart of this thing, Job Centre Plus, conditionality, IPS. Can you make that work in the current system?
Just quickly on the machine learning, I wouldn't disagree with anything Sharon said. I think also quite relevant, particularly in the UK context, is it also depends not only on the programmer, but also on the quality of the tech and the IT and the data that you've got underneath it. And we've got some real challenges around that in the UK, I would say, which brings risks in if you try and do that. Can be resolved if done in particular ways, and if done well, and if done in low risk decision making, but I would agree with most of what Sharon said. IPS and conditionality, yeah. So we bumped into this like squarely with the Work and Health unit, where you've got a unit in central gov, and we're trying to do it the same on the ground, basically in an IPS model or modified IPS model. You're trying to bring together different systems, employment and health systems, and those systems inherently at the moment have quite different cultures, both at central level and right down to frontline values and practices. So frontline health staff, if you're asking to co-locate inside them, or you're asking for referrals, they take seriously a duty of care towards their patients. You can navigate it, so you can build in local workarounds, which we did in our program, which the devolved, the mayoral combined authorities do in their programs. It's not ideal. It carries some risk. You can largely mitigate the risk, but it's not ideal. But really fundamentally what it demonstrates, even if you can largely technically work around it with the buy-in of stakeholders, including JCP district managers, what it really demonstrates is you've got internally contradictory logic inside what bits of central gov are trying to do. So the fundamental problem remains really, and for my mind, you need to try and better align the different pressures that the different parts of the system are trying to work to, and the different values and cultures, if you want to deliver a coherent, integrated kind of work health, wider support type programs. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And I think it leads us on to the question of, can we learn from elsewhere in terms of the delivery of coordinated and collaborative and innovative services in this area? And I turn to my colleague Elka Loeffler from here at the University of Strathclyde. And Elka, I know you want to talk about your experiences of co-production in employability services. So the floor is now yours, Elka.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm delighted to be part of the panel and would like to thank Colin for taking this initiative. As Colin said, I'm going to talk about user and community co-production. And of course, I'm aware that for a Scottish audience, this is nothing new. As a matter of fact, I think that in many ways, Scotland has become an international champion of co-production. So this is the good news. But the challenge is that indeed implementation of co-production in public services, including employability service, has often been much slower than expected. However, to end on a positive side, I have brought with me two innovative approaches of co-production in order to improve health and employability. And I'm now trying to share my screen, as Sharon did very successfully. So hopefully this is going to work out. Can you all see my slides?
Mm-hmm.
Very good. So, the first question is...
Can you move to slideshow in your presentation? Maybe down. Yeah.
Wait a moment, I'll increase the size. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, so the first question is, what is co-production? And obviously there are various definitions in the literature. The definition I use in my work is about co-production. Co-production of public services means public service organizations and citizens making better use of each other's assets, resources, and contributions to achieve better outcomes or improved efficiency. And as you can see from the fish and chips icon, co-production is about achieving synergies. It takes two, professionals and communities. So co-production is not about organizations working together. I call this partnership working, but obviously the two often go hand in hand. So the first case study I would like to present is about a co-commissioning approach. Obviously, the second case study will be about co-delivery. Again, these are only examples of specific co-production approaches. There are other approaches. I'll get back to that in a minute. But the reason I've chosen Surrey County Council is because this case study really shows the potential of co-production if it's embedded in a wider public service transformation strategy based on outcome-based commissioning. So the starting point was that Surrey County Council had about 1,000 young people characterized as NEET. For those of you who don't know what NEET is, NEET stands for not in employment, not in education, employment and training. And there was a budget crisis, which was actually taken as an opportunity for change. So the team in Young People Services decided to work together with partners, but actually also with young people themselves, to define a new outcome-based framework. They involved young people in specific commissioning processes. There was a much stronger focus on prevention, effective support for very disadvantaged young people. And all of that took quite a long time to plan, but the results, I think, are really impressive, because already 2 years after the implementation of this new framework, there was a 60% reduction in the number of young people categorized as NEET, and that with a 25% budget cut, and even more impressive, a 90% reduction in the number of young people who were first-time entrants to the criminal justice system. And as I've been told, there used to be 5 youth courts in Surrey County Council. Now there's only 1, which isn't even terribly busy anymore. So that shows, the synergies which can be achieved. But of course, the question for you is, why should you do co-production in Scotland? And I actually believe you've got quite powerful drivers. You've got the mandate of the Christie Commission. There's also the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Bill 2014, which again is encouraging co-production with service users and communities in public services. And I'm sure you can identify even more policy drivers which are relevant for your work. So that brings me to the key modes of co-production, because of course the question for you as practitioners is, how what does co-production mean in practice? And for those of you, or maybe your colleagues, who don't like the term co-production, well, there's an alternative. You can refer to co-commissioning approaches. So how can you embed collaboration with users and communities in the commissioning process? Adam already mentioned co-design with service users. There's also co-delivery with service users, and a fourth form of co-production is co-assessment, so basically undertaking joint evaluations. Now, if you look at these 4 codes, you will notice 3 of them, co-commissioning, co-design, and co-assessment, are about citizen voice. I'm sorry about that, something unplanned. And the third approach, co-delivery, that is about citizen action. So this is about doing stuff together with citizens. So this brings me to the German case study, and this is work I've done in my previous role as the chief executive of a non-profit organization called Governance International. We worked with Offenbach Employment Agency, which is close to Frankfurt, and we experimented in a co-production lab with new co-production approaches, and this co-production lab worked on co-delivery, and it meant that service users were matched with each other based on a strengths and weakness analysis and enabled to provide peer support to each other. For me, one of the key results was increased self-efficacy. I could see myself, and again, the team also did some evaluation, that people became a lot more self-confident, and as a matter of fact, all 6 participants taking part in this co-production lab found a job with social security contributions or training placement within 120 days. Now, I know 6 is not a high number. The experimentation will continue in the Offenbach Employment Agency, so I'm looking forward as to how this work is going to develop with other user groups. Given the lack of time, I want to end with a question for you, something you can discuss in your work with your colleagues. What are the opportunities of co-production in your organization? Which of the 4 codes which I just presented are most developed in your organization? I would like to encourage you to do an assessment. And the second issue is, which of the 4 codes are most likely to improve public outcomes in your future? So, you know, what is the potential of co-production in your organization? There are more slides which Colin is going to share with you after this presentation.
I only forgot to unmute myself once. That's not bad. Thanks so much, Elka, for being so concise. I think my sharing constrained your time there, but very clear, extremely concise. I'll say to colleagues, I think if my 2 other colleagues, Adam and Sharon, maybe you want to reveal yourselves, Adam and Sharon, as well. Perhaps if we can maybe give ourselves 10 minutes just to tick off a few more discussion points. If my colleagues are willing to hang around for 10 minutes after the allotted slot. For those of the more than 100 people still with us, we hope you'll stay with us. But if you need to drift off back to work, then thank you for being around. Can I think, again, trying to mop up a few of the challenges in the discussion bar, can I ask you, Elka, and maybe ask other colleagues to come in? I think that there's a lot of interest around more collaborative and joined up and innovative approaches at the local level, but the big pushback or challenge is often, how do we do it? So what is the governance structure, the funding structure that facilitates this? You will have very specific knowledge from your studies of other countries, Elka. Can you maybe talk a bit about that? And maybe I can challenge my UK colleagues. Again, is co-production, is this kind of user engagement possible within, or can it be accentuated within existing governance and management models in the UK? Or do we need to rip up the governance and the management and the funding and start all over again if we want this level of user engagement and innovation? Sorry, very long question, but Elka, perhaps you could start.
Yeah, well, in my research, I have compared you know, the extent to which co-production is possible in different public service constraints, so in social services, but also in other public service contexts. And the finding was that indeed having a collaborative governance framework simply enables more forms of co-production. It facilitates experimentation with new approaches. But I think the experience of the Offenbach Employment Agency also shows that actually co-production is also possible in contexts which are more characterized by hierarchy. And, you know, I would love to experiment with co-production in contexts which are more defined by marketization approaches to see to what extent, you know, it's possible under these approaches. And actually in Surrey County Council, there has been contracting out of public, in-house public services to a third sector provider, and co-production was built into the contracts, not, I would say, more with the intention to encourage co-production, to enable commissioners and service providers to learn jointly about co-production rather than taking a punitive stance, you know, in case co-production wouldn't work out. So the answer is yes, it's possible, but collaborative governance certainly helps.
My second unmute mistake. Sharon, do you have anything that you want to chip in?
Yeah, so I agree with Elke that it is possible and it's definitely desirable. I'm not personally a great fan of contracting out, especially if it's payment by results, because there's a lot of international evidence that that doesn't necessarily lead to any or many of the imagined advantages. So it doesn't necessarily save money or reduce bureaucracy or increase choice for users. It doesn't necessarily have any of these imagined results. But I know that Adam might have something different to say about how it can be designed in a way that does have those things. So definitely, how could you argue against co-production and user engagement? I think it is really important to listen to the people who are actually subject to these systems and these services, and to ask them what they themselves think, what they want, what they need, and to respond to that. But also, it is worth reflecting on the Scottish government experience of the user panels for social security, and it's not necessarily plain sailing. So I listened to a presentation from some of the Scottish government people who've been involved in that, and got the impression that there were times when some of the users on the panel wanted something that wouldn't necessarily have otherwise been supported by civil servants. So for example, things that wouldn't necessarily be in line with equalities or in line with the principles of fairness, dignity and respect. So one thing that came up on the welfare conditionality project was that when we asked people about conditionality, often they had very bad experiences themselves, but when we said, well, do you think it should exist? Then a lot of people said, yeah, we do think that there should be conditionality. And then that uncovered sometimes very racist attitudes or very harsh attitudes towards other people in different circumstances from themselves. So I think it's tricky. And then the other point I would make about co-production and user engagement is that it needs to be genuine. So sometimes it can be done in a superficial way where, like, there are a lot of things that happen. So, yeah, this has been co-produced. Do you think, was it really though? Was it? So it needs to be very deep, and there needs to be some sort of follow through in a long-term process of reflection and sort of organizational learning, so that it's not just tokenistic.
Adam, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I would completely agree. On PBR, I mean, what I'm interested in and what I think we should all be interested in is strong outcomes, as well as good experiences for service users. There are a variety of different kind of levers, accountability levers and design levers that you can use to try and design in stronger likelihoods for better outcomes. PBR is one of them, in my view. I think in Sharon, I'm sure would agree as well, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. some programs lean too heavily, rely too heavily on PBR to do all of the work, and it's actually unrealistic. PBR can't do all that work. And if you design it badly, you can bake in problems, like parking is the most obvious one, but actually poor value for money is another one. So it can definitely be done badly. I think there's a place for it in a kind of, I've answered the question on the text actually, if done in a kind of minority part potentially of a payment model where more of the funds are secure, safe, tied to service fees. And there's a variety of different levers I think we can look at, like service clawback fees if things aren't delivered as we want to try and drive outcomes. So it's a tool, it's not the only tool. It tends to be problematic as a debate because it tends to be very divisive. And I think we need to be a bit more subtle in how we think about PBR sometimes and how we design it, its role in a broader package. And co-design is another example of another lever, in my view, of a design lever, as well as a part of a process that is underused and can be very valuable for designing effective programs. So I completely agree with both Elke and Sharon, and particularly Sharon's point about being meaningful. So it's not just a tokenistic add-on. Actually, if we thoroughly, deeply co-design programs with service users, but also with frontline staff who've got enormous experience, then we can design in ways to actually design better programs, but also design better programs that are far easier to land and embed in services and to implement effectively, so we don't keep going around this very common process where the first 3 months or the first 6 months of any new program is fairly problematic. So I would agree. Great.
We're coming to the last 4 minutes. I'm going to try to get what should we do long-term unemployment. So if there was 1 or 2 priorities for building or recalibrating employability and well-being services in the post-COVID era, what would your 2 things that you would say to policymakers be? And I'll again maybe start with Elke.
Well, I think we need to make better use of the creativity of frontline staff, but also service users and communities.
Okay, again, very, very concise and also very brilliant. Sharon.
Well, get rid of sanctions for a start. This is my mantra. It has been for a few years now. I don't know if anyone's noticed. Get rid of sanctions, but then that's already been done in Fair Start Scotland. So I think this is sort of getting back to the earlier question as well of like, do we need everything to change before we can do something? And I think no, I think there's an awful lot that can be done. We can make a big difference by taking action locally and doing things according to good principles and good practices, despite that nasty system still being in place. It makes it harder, it makes it more costly, but there is an awful lot that can be done. So I think people have a lot of knowledge and experience already in local areas. So I think act on that despite whatever else is going on.
Fantastic, thank you, Sharon. And last word to you, Adam.
I think we should reallocate capacity. You see growth under COVID makes this really clear. We've got a load of people inside the system being supported by frontline, particularly JCP staff, who aren't getting much from that process. I would release a lot of that capacity to focus on, you know, the moderate to high severity need. Actually, I think there'd be much better use of resource. And I would focus much more on integration. How can we better join up partners and budgets and services vertically across tiers of government and locally, horizontally and centrally horizontally across different services and departments? We can do a lot better job. We can make much better use of the resources we have if we build a much more collaborative, better integrated model.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. We're going to end about 8 minutes late, but I think we can forgive ourselves for that. A few final housekeeping and thank yous. This recording will be available and I'll make sure that link finds its way to all participants. I'll also make sure that all participants have a link to our 3 brilliant speakers, and as I was saying, you will find that their research is readily available, and if you can't, click through to email them and they'll be delighted, I'm sure, to share their research with you. I want to thank the very rich stakeholder and academic, but especially stakeholder audience who zoomed in today. Thanks to all those very hardworking public servants in health, employability, job centres, many of whom have taken a little bit of time out of their day to discuss with us today. We're very grateful for your work, and thanks for spending the time to engage with us. And thanks so much to our 3 brilliant keynotes. There's no fee here, there's no reward for these people other than to give a bit of their time in order to engage in debate and share their fantastic insights. So Adam, Sharon, Elka, thank you so much for taking the time. And with that, I'll draw our webinar to a close. Thanks everyone for attending. Have a very pleasant rest of the day and a great weekend, and stay safe.
Thanks, Colin. Thank you.